By tending to the unseen aspects of the soil and the cosmic forces, we are given an opportunity to tend to those unseen forces within ourselves. Welcome to this episode of Tend the Flame. I'm Kate Brenton, creator, teacher, and guide, also the author of Rebirth, the book, based on this podcast. Stories about letting go and the art of letting life lead. You can purchase it wherever books are sold. This particular episode is an offering to the earth-based wisdom traditions, biodynamics, Vedic philosophy, Celtic traditions, Rudolph Steiner, and also an homage to mothers everywhere that are working to create worlds of whimsy and nature for children to thrive. Our guest is Danielle Carr Jarecha. She's a mama, wife, herbalist, yogini, astrologer, and biodynamic land steward. She's the sole force behind Mothercraft Herbal, working from seed to bottle on every creation and seeing clients for herbal and astrological consultations. Mothercraft, as you'll learn through this episode, is a biodynamic and organic line of herbal remedies, beauty products, teas, oils, and elixirs, created with intention using Vedic astrology and ancient moon wisdom. She uses biodynamic practices on her farm, along with Vedic astrology and ancestral wisdom in crafting and preparations. Her mission is to create conscious conversation with nature through the cosmos, earth and prana of the plants, and culminating in full body healing and connection. You want to learn more about Danielle or her upcoming workshops, you can connect with her on Instagram at mothercraft_herbal or her website, mothercraftherbal.com. This episode is actually full of coincidence. Not coincidences, but coincidence, a phrase that a client recently shared with me. It's a coalescence. See if when you're listening, you can hear the larger invitation at hand. We always here at Tend the Flame appreciate you sharing our episodes, tagging us, leaving us a review if you have a moment on the Apple Podcast. It helps this podcast thrive. If you want to promote conscious conversations, we need to promote conscious conversations, and little things you do by sending it to a friend who might be curious about biodynamics or who could be uplifted by this conversation helps amplify conscious living. If you also have stories to share or are a little scared to write them, Sit and Write might be a spot for you. It's a space where the spiritual and practical sides of writing coalesce to serve mission-led writers. It's really important. Mission-led writers. Now, your mission could be anything. It could be cooking, dogs, or just sharing your story. But those that come to Sit and Write are looking to share their wisdom for the readers that are waiting to be uplifted, to be empowered by what you have to share. If this piques your curiosity, schedule a free connection call with me. We have a spring cohort opening up. It will be small and intimate because we plan to go deep. You can send an email to kate@katebrenton.com. You can go onto my website, click on courses, and see what other writers say. You can also see that we're offering writing getaways, which is super fun. And you can also see what we're up to over there. We do have local events. So get your warm cup of something delicious, or if you're driving, keep your eyes on the road, but your heart open. I know you'll enjoy this episode. Thanks for tuning in. Danielle, I am excited to be here with you on the eve of Imbolc.
Yes.
Which is not new. Let's just start with when we talk about Celtic traditions. These are not new. Like anything else, this is slightly disparaging what I'm going to say, but like 90s fashion comes back, right? Things are revered, they go away, they come back. Myths have existed. You hit points in your life where they come to you because there is medicine in them. Mm-hmm. So it feels that the languaging of St. Bridget and Imbolc are new, but there will be a lot of listeners that'll say, well, that's not new. I've had that since childhood in my ancestry. So it's a both and, right? It's a both and. Can you explain to us, though, what is this day? What is going on?
So this day is considered the first spring.
Mhm.
So even though in the west, like, well, that's still considered west too, but even though in our current times, we look at winter beginning on December 21st and spring beginning on March 21st, in reality, there are stirrings,
Mhm. And
right?
we can even
So,
feel that now. Yeah, there's stirrings.
yeah,
It's a great phrase. Yes.
there are stirrings, and those things are kind of brought on by rotations cosmically,
Hmm.
by the time of day, the way the sun's rising, all of that. So we really start to feel the stirrings of winter on October 31st, which is Samhain.
Mhm.
That is when we start to go really inward because
Mhm.
we're really getting to the darkest part of the year.
Mhm.
And then it's actually on winter solstice that it's 3 days after where it starts to lengthen. So
Which I
when
always
we're,
find, I have to say, I always find is like, if you want to explain the polarity of human, because December is when I start to be like, it's so cold. Like I know, and I attend to the inner flame of like, oh, I'm supposed to provide the light. Oh, that makes a lot more sense of why I am, hunkered down and in soup season, and I'm not feeling in my physical self that the light is returning, right? But it's when I start to
right,
attend to the unspoken that I'm like, oh yeah, I am getting these ideas. Oh yeah, this is a communal time. Or so I just want to reflect that it's not
yeah,
always this easy thing to tune into if you're not, if you're not if you haven't been given the perspective to perceive it.
exactly. And also, even though that like those days start to lengthen, by a little, really over time, that window between that Christmas week and the week after New Year's
Hmm.
is really dark.
It is.
It's a really and interestingly enough, that is when we have all these celebrations, right? So you can't help but think that's why they're there,
Right.
right? Because, however, that's fine, but there are such, if you allow yourself to get really dark,
Hmm.
there's a lot of insight during that time because you're really, it's like you're getting ready to give birth, right?
Yes.
So
Yes.
you're in the third trimester at that point. And then
Hmm.
Imbolc comes
Hmm.
and it's like, okay, like you're feeling a little like January seems like the longest month ever,
It does.
right?
It
All
does.
31 days of her, I mean, and
Hmm.
she's not stopping until the 31st.
That's
Like
right.
it
Full
just
on.
keeps going.
Yes. Yep.
And there's something that does happen when we shift into February, even though it's still cold where we are in the Northeast,
Hmm.
there are these stirrings.
Hmm.
And if it's been a warm winter like we had last year, I mean, I was finding dandelions
Yeah.
in February.
Hmm.
So that's usually a sign of Bridget too, because dandelion is her flower, that's her plant, that's her herb. And so it's really about welcoming in the air element. Okay, so we're moving out of the earth element. And it's, if you want a really nice visual, you picture the old crone
Hmm.
and she's like reaching out her hand today and she's handing Bridget the baton,
Oh,
right?
I love that. Yeah.
So that's where we're at. That's the
And then
shift.
who does Bridget hand it off to?
So then Beltana comes,
Hmm.
and then that's handed off to, in my uh, lineage, in my herbal lineage, that's handed off to Shilonagig, which is the creation figure because
Hmm.
she's not technically known as a goddess. She's not, she's those old carvings in the stone that has her vulva pulled back
Hmm.
in full creative gesture.
Hmm.
So that's where we move into. So right now we're lighting the flame, we're planting the seeds. We're actually taking all of the inner things that we gathered through
Stirrings.
winter,
Mm-hmm.
right? And figuring out where they go,
For sure. That's for
right?
sure. You could even see it on like, we'll say the social media entrepreneurial world where people are like, how are your intentions? And I'm not totally going to go into the Gregorian because there's so much good stuff. I'm not silencing you at all. So it's
Yeah.
just there's
Yeah.
so much good stuff I want the listeners to hear today. There
Mm-hmm.
is this idea that we have this like collective thing of the new. And I always love celebrating a new moon or a new
Of
intent. Like
course.
I'm
Yeah.
down. But then there is that January whole as a holding. You really
Mm.
don't create the change, you know. And I heard one, and I've borrowed that you can ride that idea of the new, but then take, you know, and I have always liked, I like to honor Imbolc. I like Bridget. I mean, I'm a books and fire, you know.
Yeah.
So the idea of the February between then and February being like, well, what's the space that you're clearing? You know, for I've heard you talk about like cleaning the hearth, like what needs to get cleaned up? You have this great idea. Awesome. And if you have kids, is the table clean? Can we bring out our art supplies? What needs to get put away? It's like now we're on the cusp right now, and to use the words we've talked about, the threshold of like, okay, placement. You cleaned everything up. You got what you needed. Every time we have an idea, you might be like, oh, it doesn't exactly work that way. I got to kind of go back to the, you know, to the board. And maybe the better language and the better metaphor to bring in would be soil. And I'll give a little intro to me on when I did the garden the first time and did not research and spent the whole summer fighting with grubs and
Mm.
had a major reflection on myself that like I spent all the time with the seeds. I had in tuned with the plants because I knew I have labeled myself as not being super good at keeping plants alive. And I took all of my effort to the seeds and I did a really good job with the seeds, but I didn't pay attention to the soil
Mm.
and I rushed. And there was a lot of wasted effort and there was a
Mm.
lot of frustration. And so I thought, well, I can abandon this. You know, you go through the whole summer and then and fall so that you're going to take us deeper into this. I was like, I need to learn about soil. And then that metaphor has just kind of taken over in a lot of places because
Mm.
it's a potent one. You know, the seeds are fun. The new journal and the intention is great. That is super awesome. But the discipline and the fortitude is the soil. The consistency is the soil. And one of the reasons I want to have you on here is to share because you hold different traditions. One by birth was a Celtic. You committed to Vedic, you know, there was discipline there over a long period of time. And then I'm guessing from what I know, and correct me please, but with motherhood, like anthroposophy and Steiner and biodynamics came in. And when you appreciate wisdom traditions, my opinion is they are all distinct and yet they're all similar. And they don't need to be like the other. But when you don't make them be like the other, it's very easy to see where the truths overlap and where they
Mm.
pertain to place, right? Because if you're talking about Eastern Europe or you're talking about the Hawaiian Islands, or if you're talking about, you know, what does a basic gardener ask me? Well, what zone are you in, Kate? I'm like, what are you talking about? Why are you asking me what zone I'm in? I want
Yeah.
tomatoes, right? Like, so it's whatever level you're looking at this of depth of soil that you want to get into, it's there. And so
Yeah.
can you lead us into what biodynamics is, why soil is such a big thing? If we have a biodynamic farmer on there, they could probably talk to you for 3 years on soil. Could you talk to us about why that's such a potent place?
Yeah. Yeah. And I think where I'll start is how it enters in, or how it entered in for me. Um, I was very deep in my Vedic studies at the time. It was, I think, 2008. I was traveling through Costa Rica. I went to this vanilla farm and I met this eccentric man, this farmer, who was showing me, we spent a day there, and he was showing me how he impregnated each and every orchid on that farm. And he spoke about Steiner the whole time. I had heard the name before, didn't really know much. He was such a character and he actually was one of the founders of Frontier, culinary herb company. And he left because why does it ever happen? It's like, because practices then become less sacred, right?
Diluted. They get diluted
Yeah.
when they grow or expand too big.
And he was interested in truly healing the earth through practices, right? So he went on, he did this farm, and that was tucked in my back pocket. And I thought about Steiner, and then in 2010, I was in Israel, and I happened to be placed with a family during a yoga teacher training that were Theosophists. And their children were, they were art therapists, and I lived in their house. Everybody else lived in the yoga house. I got there, one of 45 people that was placed in somebody's home. And it changed me forever, because in that home, I realized as I was sitting at my table with two small children, that I actually got a glimpse of my future life while I was staying with that family. And so when I left there, I was still very heavy in my Vedic, studies and all of that. And then when I met Ravi, we started talking about children, and I said, well, I brought up Steiner.
Did you?
And I was like, this is how I want to raise my children. And we had a serious conversation, and he was like, he's like, sure, and I was like, no, it's so involved. There's so many aspects, right?
It's very involved.
It's very involved. So where we started was Waldorf education, right? And while my son was experiencing Waldorf education, he had an assistant teacher that would come in the afternoons, Mr. Carl. And Mr. Carl also held a book study once a week. And I attended that. And it was there that when we can talk about Christ and karma and reincarnation in one place, I'm in, because I went from Catholicism to Vedic, and now here I am in anthroposophy, where both of those can live.
That I have to say that was a breath for me as well. I knew Steiner because my roommate was a Waldorf teacher when I had absolutely no, but what it healed for me was when I went into her classroom, it healed me as a teacher, because I had to make choices teaching at the public high school system that really were not okay for me. And when I saw what those children had from a teacher's eyes, I actually had like a whole, and she saw it. She's like, there's so many adults do this. She's like, so many adults come in and they see what could have been, or their child heals, because you don't know. You just don't know. So I'm saying that because even this podcast can find you. Like, that's sort of how this works. Seeds travel, and they can lay dormant for as long as they need to. I mean, Kim was just somebody that I talked to about really cool things about art, because I had divorced that side of myself because I was too linear. And that's sort of how Steiner came in for me, because she was like, oh, no, we're all art, this whole Steiner, you can draw the bird and all of that. And so it's interesting to me that then you have an elder come in, and then if we fast forward, Carl is, I'm going to say, is your steward or your guide in learning about the soil. Is that true? I might not be right about that.
Yes. Am I right? So Carl he opened the door. So we were doing a study, 2020 happened. Obviously, Carl has played a huge part in my life. In so many aspects, right? So I have this relationship with him as kind of like a mentor. And then he ends up being like the actual teacher for my child in 2020, when everything shut down. And then it was that year, 2020, where I had moved out of the city. So I had been reading, I guess somewhere around 2017, I started reading the agriculture lectures, Steiner's agriculture lectures. And they're very hard to read by yourself.
Yes.
You have to go through that as a a program, because you need each sentence like most of his books, but even more so in the, like, it's unbelievable to think that that book, that those lectures were a weekend.
It's really dense,
It's
and
super dense.
and to mix metaphors, stuff like that makes me think of termas. Like you can walk past them, but they don't open until it comes back to soil, because soil is your mind. It's setting your mind. I've
It,
also broken that word apart. People say mindset and they don't think about it. So now I'm saying, no, you're setting your mind. You know,
yes.
that's what the soil is how are you setting your mind? Because you have to set the soil, right? So he becomes your guide through these
And
texts.
yep. And like I said, I had attempted the lectures a
Mhm,
couple years prior
mhm.
to 2020, but in 2020 I moved, and I knew in my heart. Now, I'll just go back just for a second. In like 2001, I
Mhm.
had a Vedic astrology reading, and that was what kicked off kind of my Vedic astrology studies. And I was told that I was, I was going to experience abundance in land and real estate. And to me at that time, like agriculture, they kept talking about agriculture, and I was living literally in the
Downtown
city.
Philly, like downtown Philly, like walking everywhere
And
day.
I
Right.
remember thinking like, well, I've already bought I did buy a house when I was 22, so maybe it's real estate and not agriculture. I
Right. And
remember,
you were a
right?
successful business owner, hair salon, which just in case anyone hasn't listened to, you've been on the podcast
Yeah.
before. So you are in the like stewardship of business, hairstyling,
Yes.
and so agriculture is just not even landing, even
Yeah.
though the whisper is being told to you. That's what's
Right. Like
happening.
the only thing I could tie to that is that I was using like, plant-based products in my
Sure.
salon, like
Sure.
there really
Hmm.
wasn't anything to hang a coat on there.
Hmm.
And so anyway, I took it as real estate, and I always looked at my fourth house going, I know it's strong, but like
Fourth
something,
house would be in your astrology chart, and the fourth
yes, and
house just
that's the house of that's
okay.
the home, the mother. You can read a lot about someone from their fourth house, their emotions, right? So my fourth house is super strong. And but I always just went, it's real estate,
Sure.
it's real estate, it's business, real estate, whatever. So I go on my Jyotish studies, and then I'm using the sidereal zodiac, right?
Let me
Which
pause you.
very
There's
hard place.
there's different houses of there's different studies of astrology, and since we want to focus on biodynamics, you can definitely look that up, but you focus on the Vedic, which is called Jyotish. So if you for the listeners that don't know, Jyotish is the Vedic interpretation and placement of the stars, which does not occur based on date, but based on placement. Is that a fair layman's
So
definition?
like when it's an astronomical representation, so it's a picture of the sky.
Got it.
When the sun is in Capricorn, you can look up and see the sun is in Capricorn. It's
So that
not,
could be a practice if somebody's curious, literally.
yes,
Okay.
yes. And it is the ancient Babylonian, it wasn't until Ptolemy that it was a moon, feminine centered astrology based on where the stars were at. All of your ancient cultures followed this. Ptolemy came along and he made a sun-based astrology, which
Masculine.
is what we know as tropical astrology. So I have this Vedic background. I'm reading the lectures and I'm like, this is amazing because I'm not getting affirmed anywhere except for in my Jyotish community, because everybody I know is, talking about the newspaper astrology.
Okay, so you're
Like when
reading the agriculture studies and you're getting confirmation in your Vedic circle about what you're learning about biodynamics. Am I hearing that
yeah,
correctly?
because biodynamics uses the sidereal zodiac. It has to, because if we're talking about the soil and the cosmic forces, right? We have to be following where the actual stars and planets are, because that's how they're affecting the earth.
Well, that's the pause. People will say they do and don't believe in that, but then if you're a surfer, you believe in it because that's when you decide when the waves are there. And you know who else is the secret knower of that? Kindergarten teachers.
Yeah.
Because they'll tell you, it was my sister who was like, oh yeah, the full moon affects kids because all my kids. So it's like what is talked about publicly and what is accepted in niche human. It's not just the astrologers or it's not just the people who are spiritual
No,
seekers that harness that.
it's the
Farmers,
farmers.
yeah,
it's the farmers know. I mean, you know, when your flower that just bloomed looks different than the other flower that bloomed, and it was because the moon was waxing and not waning. Like there are, like when you don't need to study astrology. You can work in the garden,
For
right?
serious, you
If
can
you're
work in the garden.
if you're really, if you're present, right? If
And
you're
Kit,
really taking notice.
well, here's the thing. I consider myself a very present person. I annihilated the garden situation the first time. Part of it was because there was help that like decisions were being made that I didn't really, and I learned a lot. So
Yeah.
if someone's like, if they're me, right, I don't want them to hear like, well, I'm not present, so I can't do it. It's like, well, you're not,
Oh no.
but you can grow it. It's a relationship. And honestly, if you saw my watermelons and my arugula and my flowers at the end of this year, I was like, we're working. We got it. We got a plan for next year. Like it
Yeah.
is this triumph and watching my child run out and be excited and have that
Mhm.
communion, which I know you're going to talk about. So you don't have to be a gardener
No.
to benefit from the relationship of the garden is what I would like people to hear.
And can you hold that? It's an initiation.
Yes.
Okay. So that's not wasted. Each mistake, and that's what I've learned. And I think that's what's made me easier on myself as a person through gardening, is that I don't see things as mistakes anymore. Because when I made that mistake the season before, I got to know it. I figured it out. I opened my heart. I opened my mind. I listened. And then guess what? I mastered it the next season. So that is because, I mean, someone like me, again, coming from the city, I had some garden boxes in the city. I had beautiful cedar garden boxes, and I was growing herbs because I was studying herbs, right? So in between that Vedic studies and biodynamics, there was herbalism. And so it was like it was aspects of things that were inching me towards really then getting my hands in the soil. It's like I had the relationship with the plants, but what about all the things that make the plant,
Exactly.
right? And it's like, so what biodynamics did for me was it was like a homecoming for the way I saw the stars, which was so relieving because outside of the Jyotish community, I couldn't really have that conversation, even though I was writing newsletters and making posts talking about nakshatras, and God bless everyone who, read it and listened to it. And, I still do it. And I stayed committed to that because I do believe that these constellations, they represent an energy.
Mm-hmm.
And if you can move past the zodiac, the sign, all these bigger things, if you can move past that and just really, what is the essence? So like today the moon, right now it's going to shift at like 2:15, but right now it's in Hasta. Hasta is a hand extending outward, right?
Mm-hmm.
So what is today? It's an opportunity to receive. So if we just, it's like simple, right? Like these things are there to be energetic guides. And then when I found biodynamics, it was like, oh, wait, like everything is here, right? So,
Let me ask a quick question.
yeah.
Biodynamics,
Mm-hmm.
step one for a relationship would be you're gardening with the farmer's almanac. Fair? You look at what the almanac, if you don't know what the word biodynamic means, but if you have
Yes.
heard of the farmer's almanac, you know that the farmer's almanac will give you a very simple thing of these are good moons. Like the Hawaiian calendar will tell you, like, these are moons to plant on, these are moons not to do anything on, these are the moons to fish on. So their calendar goes through the whole anyway, there's
Yes.
different cultural calendars. So you might have heard these concepts before, but you just might not have heard them to the extent of biodynamics. But maybe you knew that your grandmom always did something one time of year, but you didn't know because it was still embedded into natural
Yes.
practice. Is that fair?
Yes. Yes. And what I use, I don't use the Farmer's Almanac, but I use the biodynamic calendar,
What's the
right?
difference?
So the biodynamic calendar, two people did the first person was Maria Toon, and then Sherry Waldifer started another one. I think it was in the 70s, and that's the one I use. And in that calendar, she gives you the placement of every planet each day. And in simpler terms, sorry, the chickens are going nuts. Someone must have laid an egg. I love how they celebrate every time they
There's
lay
a
an egg.
birth.
Come on, like, shouldn't we too? It's like,
Yeah.
why? Like, I just love it. So anyway, they're like yelling out there. So in simple terms, okay, when we are working with the roots, right? So say you want to plant burdock.
Okay.
You want to wait until the moon is in an earth sign because the earth supports the roots, right? So in that calendar, she uses the glyphs. And so the glyph of, say, Capricorn and, the moon in Capricorn is there, right? And then it'll say root day. And sometimes you'll see half of the day is a flower day and half of the day is a root day. So when you're dealing with growing flowers, you want to grow them on like a fruit day, right? And fruit flowers, that is going to be, when the moon is in a water sign, right? So that's simplified.
Which we appreciate,
Yeah.
because now I'll link the calendar in the show notes. And if somebody wants to learn more, right, we can go. But what I'm also hearing
Yes.
is the discipline of you can't have it all. Meaning, sure, you could plant your plants whenever you want. That's your choice. If
Yeah.
you would like, Steiner does that meditation where you hold the seed. It's in Knowing Higher Worlds.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I
Yeah.
use it all the time in my teaching of like, look at the seed,
Yeah.
and it's like, okay, hold it. Now imagine it. And sure, you put it in the soil and you add water, but imagine the soil and water. What's the unseen element? Hold the seed and become aware, or ask to see, or be in tune with what is the next element, because it's not just seed. It's not just soil and water and sun, although the sun is your clue. And you hold that seed, and you could just take, if you're listening and you're like, well, what seed whatever seed you have, you just take whatever seed you have and you put it in your hand. And then you start to realize, well, do I want there's nothing wrong with, I grow marigolds and that's all I grow. They love you. Marigolds are fantastic. They're a great plant. But are you talking to her, or is she just by the mailbox? There's like this idea of how deep do you want to go? And the
Yeah.
garden seems to be a metaphor of, if you would really like to grow plants that have a more arduous relationship, or would like to harness me in my fullest bloom and my fullest medicinal availability for you and your family, then there are rules. And that is where everyone bumps up to in the current world. What do you mean
Yes.
there's rules? And it's like, well, you could run with this and buy another one next year at Home Depot, no shame. But if you would like to have a relationship, there's rules.
There's
And I
rules.
feel like biodynamic is like a walkway through, how deep do you want to go? Because you could go very deep, but this could take over your whole. I mean, it's very demanding on its
Absolutely.
fullest form. It's Steiner in his fullest form is very demanding. Fair?
I mean, it's my full-time job. Like there is no time off from this. Like, I'm sorting my seeds now. They'll get planted in a few weeks. And then the season starts and it goes until Samhain. And it's like, I have to then go, wait, we can't travel here. I need somebody to come over here. And like, so like, there are certain times that I won't travel because I need to be the one. It's not just about watering. So I don't just ask the neighbor to water the plants. Like I have someone specific that I ask to water my plants because I know that they're going to interact. They're going to come in and they're going to have a conversation. They're going to greet the plants, right? So I think, so biodynamics in its most simple explanation is it's a holistic approach to gardening.
Mm-hmm.
And for someone like myself, who had years and years of Vedic astrology studies under my belt, I was finally able to really draw connections, right? Because like, I don't need the calendar. I know today that the moon's in Virgo because so now we're dealing with forces of Mercury, we're dealing with the air element. So we're gonna, if it was March, I'd plant nettle today. You know what I mean? So it's like, it becomes like that, where it's not even looking things up. It's knowing what forces we're working with today, where the moon is, what that's activating, what planets are getting activated this day.
Well, why is that so important with biodynamics and the stirring? And some of these questions I know, but I want you to tie those things together for us.
Yes. So we know that water and soil, right? Super important. What we've witnessed and what we see today is a breakdown in both, right? So good water, like people think I'm crazy, but for the last 3 years, I fill the back of my car up and I drive and I fill up our drinking water. And even though we have a reverse osmosis filter for the house, we're not drinking that. Because like my husband likes to say, whether it's filtered or not, it's dead.
Right.
It's been dead. Dead water is dead water, whether it's filtered or not, right? So, and some of us don't have access to it. I did not have access to spring water when I was in the city unless I wanted to drive pretty far to get it. And I did
Then
sometimes.
just but as a daily practice, it's difficult to say the least.
So you can find springs near you. There's an app called Find a Spring, and you just put your zip code in and it'll take you to a spring. So it's like that, right? So I'm going to fetch this water for our drinking because I want these minerals, right? I want something alive that's going in. What we see with food today is that it's growing in dead soil. Okay.
People don't understand. They think that's an opinion. It's not an opinion.
Not an opinion.
No.
Like the forces, the elementals, what I have learned through the last couple years, 4 years now, in working and doing stirs and sprays is that just like the archangels, this is a metaphor that came to me one time while I was doing silica. Silica is a spray that draws the forces up, right? So this is 501. So we take, ground up crystals, that's what silica is, and they get put in a horn, in a cow horn, and it gets buried under the earth in the spring. And you have to bury it where the sun is going to shine for a greater part of the day. And that, as it moves through the summer until the fall, is receiving the sun's forces, right? It's getting activated. Just like we get activated in the sun. We feel different when we spend time in the sun.
Yes.
So this is what's happening, right? And then we dig this up in the fall. And then we take little bits of it, tiny bit, and we mix it with 2.5 gallons of water. And we create something that Steiner called chaos, right? So you want to go in one direction and then you full stop, go in the other. And you do this for an hour, right? And like I was saying to you with the washing, there's something with me with repetitive motion. I can enter into a very meditative, present space. And what I'm doing is I am calling on specific, so we have different elementals that work with different elements, right? So we have the sylphs. That's if we're working with the air element, so the wind and the trees. So when I do the kids' workshops, I can talk in this language and they get it.
They get it.
They get it. It is so clear. As a matter of fact, the last one I did in the fall, we talked a lot about the fire element and that maybe we'll get lucky and find some salamanders because there are fire elementals, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that's who we look to when we want to work and engage with the fire element. We look to the gnomes when we're working with the earth.
Mm-hmm.
And we look to the undines when we're working with the water, right? So these are the names. I'm using names that Steiner gave them. There are names in the ancient Druid. There are names everywhere.
There are names everywhere.
There are names everywhere for these beings, and they've just been kept alive in certain cultures. Like if you go to Iceland, you're going to hear about the gnomes.
Yeah.
Go to Ireland, they're going to talk about the fairies very matter-of-factly.
Yes.
Like this is not some
Right.
woo-woo stuff. This is
Mm-hmm.
it's as real as our reality. But because we have trampled on the soil, they are, and we've not tried to engage. It's like being in a relationship and not putting the work in. The person's not going to show up.
I could not agree with this more. I remember when I was no longer living in Philadelphia and I had come back to do session work and had called out, as I do, to the surrounding area. And I was working at a friend's place in Chestnut Hill. And she came into the room and she had noticed a vibration in the room. And she said, they want to know how long you're staying.
Mm.
And I was kind of a sophomore, like I had just, not literally for the listeners. I mean, I was the wise fool. I was given tools. They worked in one place because when I was on one land, that language was connected to a framework that is connected to a relationship that I had willingly went into. And in honor, not to like stir up, I was simply repeating tools that I was told to honor place. And I got into these beautiful conversations of, well, when was the last time this place was asked? And just like you said, there's just only so many times you can ask a friend, can you come over? Can you come over? Can you come over? And the friend says, well, could you come over to my house? Oh, no, you live too far away. And the friend's like, well, you know what, actually, I'm traveling the same distance. So why don't we wait until you can find the time to come to my house? So I love what you are speaking of because I'm going off a little here, but you're giving me the opportunity to, we flock to these beautiful power spots. What are you giving when you go? And why are you not asking them to help you when, I remember the first time an actual, Peruvian shaman, which means he was a householder. He was doing his shaman duty for the travelers, and then he was going home to his family. So I'm not trying to glorify anything. That was his job. And he said to me, what are the names of your mountains? And I was like, Pennsylvania mountains? I don't know. Humbling. And he didn't have to ask me rudely because he could see in my eyes I didn't know the answer. He could see in my eyes. But you can stop there, or you can let these invitations come. Like maybe I didn't get it the first time I was asked, but man, did I not go home and start looking at the appropriate names and start learning the Lenape names for the animals that I loved and the river and finding out what Manayunk was and I took the invitation, and started. So I feel very grateful for this thing that you're bringing up that is gardening.
Yes.
Because without that dirty dirt, nothing else that you're placing on top of it, no matter how far you build it up, no matter how clean or how fancy or how high tech it is, it's still sitting upon the soil and the mother.
Absolutely. And it's still vibrating. So that, like your friend said when they came into the room, right? It's like the way I was able to like explain it, because it's very hard to explain these things, right? You talk about traveling to these places. I was a pilgrimager. That's what I did for a very long time. And I did receive a lot of medicine from those places. But again, we got to go back to where we chose to be born, why we chose to be born there, and there is medicine for that, right?
Yes.
And when I was very fortunate when we came looking for a house, I walked in to the property and I received, and so did my husband, this in-breath that was profound. And I'm telling you, I didn't have it out in the driveway. It wasn't until I came through the gates. I hadn't been in the house yet. He looked at me and I looked at him and I said, this is it. What I found, and I didn't even need to ask, the man that owned the home for 20 years had never sprayed a thing on this land. He had cultivated every aspect of it, planted his hands. He did not put much time into the home. You know, there was a lot of work that needed to be done. But when I wrote him a letter, I asked him if he would please consider us because stuff was flying like hotcakes at that time.
The market was unreal.
And I was like, we're never going to get this house. Oh my God. Like there was somebody in the driveway waiting afterwards. And I'm like, we've got to make an offer. Like, I just was like, we have to be here. Like, I'm meant to take care of this. Somebody else cannot take care of this, you know? And that's how I wrote the letter. And he cried. He couldn't ask for anything more than someone that was willing to step in.
And
now
take care.
he's tired to step in. He wasn't doing biodynamics. He just wasn't spraying chemicals. And neither were
It's
my
love.
neighbors,
Here's the
right?
thing. That's the piece. It's the love. It always trumps it. It always trumps it.
He had the care. He knew everything about this place. And then he knew I was going to bring it to another
the next level.
And the only way I can describe, I was doing the, so when we moved here, we did not have animals.
Right.
And that first year of stirs, I was getting profound. I mean, they were starving for communication.
The plant, the land.
Yeah. And they showed me this picture, or at least I received this picture that just the way the archangels are right there as the in-between for us to God, Godhead, whatever you want to call it, like you kind of can go through them. That's who we are for them.
Oh, that's beautiful.
They don't have a body.
They don't have a body.
They don't have the intellect. They don't have, they need co-creation. And it's in that co-creation that we can heal ourselves, right? Because I'm trying to, you know, take care of the land because 2020 showed me that I probably need to do that, right? And because I can't depend on outside sources for anything. And if I care about this land, I need to do something about it. I felt a real impulse. And so here I was shown this picture, and it was a picture that made sense to me. That might not be a picture that makes sense to someone that maybe didn't grow up praying to archangels and all
I
of that.
love that you said that because consciousness will translate itself to the message, to those who need to receive it. So it's not that one is red and one is blue and that is right or wrong. It's the message.
Right. And they knew how I could comprehend that, right? Like, oh, let's show her some archangels. And so, and like she has this archetypal landscape already. She already has the blueprint. And if we show it to her that way, she's going to get it.
Yes.
If somebody else that's stirring, that's coming from a different background, they're going to get a different picture.
Yes.
And this is not anything supernatural. I will say that my yoga practice taught me to listen. I will say that. It primed me for this because now what's happening is instead of a passive connecting in, I can just go do a prep and spray, and I'm getting to the same place, right?
So wouldn't this be, I'm in this moment feeling this, you know how people say you have to have good boundaries to get clear on what you want, and that humans have difficulty articulating what they actually want because of these stories, right? But
Yeah.
then when you get into presence, it starts to, I think what it starts to do is it widens the aperture and it has a container.
Yeah.
You need the boundaries in the container. For some people, that is a daily practice, that is a yoga practice. For some people, that's a walking practice, it's a gardening, it's a practice. It's a rut in the rut's not that word, but it's like it's a carving into the neurology of the human where something can be potentized. We have a guest coming on that does like you go out into the wilderness for like rite of passage for different ages or
Oh
something like
yeah,
that.
the journeys,
Yeah,
yep.
for different ages. And
It's not coming to
yeah, it's
me,
not coming in
but
this moment.
I know what you're talking about.
But I'm going to borrow his phrase. He said, I was talking to him like, oh, I can't wait to have you on. We could talk about the difference between unschooling and why there needs to be structure for children in some way. And he goes, oh, kids need structure because they'll go everywhere. And they need to be able to go deep. You need the structure that gives their forces the ability to go into depth. And I go, that's it. You've
Yeah,
just articulated, which of course, because it's an indigenous practice, like his model is based off of that. What I'm hearing is you saying the same thing. So when you're
yeah,
on a podcast, it's talking about tending the flame. The thing it's not called lighting a fire, because lighting a fire is one time.
yeah.
That's easy. Everybody can do that. Who's watching the logs to see when it's the right time, checking if the wood is wet? Biodynamics is a whole other level of commitment to that. But you can't just run outside after a rainstorm and throw a log on. You just knocked your hearth out. Now you got smoke all over your room and it's not fun anymore, right? So when you're telling us to pay attention to the planets and what the moon is doing, it is that same principle in more depth, but isn't it the same thing to pay attention to the elements of the day, the timing and the placement of what needs to happen?
Absolutely, because I've planted things, in different constellations, and I've gotten different things.
Mm.
So it's not just in a book, and some it's not for everyone.
Mhm.
I'm not saying you need biodynamics to garden, but anyone in regenerative farming or biodynamics will tell you that this is not just working with the elements. So I'm talking about this, right, with the elementals. But what happens is they have work, and they also work with there's relationships with certain herbs and nitrogen, and certain herbs and calcium, and certain herbs and sulfur. Like, if you have a lack of nitrogen in your soil, this is why I have chickens. Yes, they give us eggs. Wonderful. I can't have a cow here. I'm not even supposed to have chickens, but I can't have a cow here, right? And I could really use the manure for my compost to bring in the nitrogen, right?
Mm-hmm.
But instead, I use the chicken poop,
Mm-hmm.
right? And the chickens, I in the beginning would scoop it into a wheelbarrow and take it over to the compost. But as the chickens came of age and weren't babies anymore, and we let them out, where do you think they went to go eat?
Right.
So they're getting a little bit of nibbles on my, compost pile, but they're leaving their poop.
Right.
Okay. So it's like when we open the door, they run there.
Mm.
This is not, this is nature. Like, this is how it works. And it's like, after I started doing the stirs, the kids and Robbie were like, gosh, we got so many birds. Like, wow, like we get these like flocks of birds, right? And I know why, right? And I'm not saying anything. And next thing you know, it's like, we really want bunnies, mommy. And then I'm like, oh, so then the bunnies come in. And then I start seeing bunnies everywhere. And then 2 years ago, the frogs showed up. And when the frogs show up, I know this from being in Ireland and people in Ireland, it's a big deal. The frogs are showing up, all is well. So all of a sudden, I started to see all these the amount of butterflies, and so all of a sudden, all the creatures started to come. They started to end up here somehow. And it's because of the forces, right? It's waking up the soil. It's waking things up. And so it's not just that we are working with elementals and in this metaphysical world. It also is very physical and concrete and scientific. I can talk to my husband who has a very science mind, and if he tests the soil, he's like, you're lacking this, you're lacking that. And in my brain, I go, oh, all right, I'm just going to plant some more of,
Right.
or I'm going to
That's
spray
the translation. That's the translation.
Right. Or I'm going to spray this, right? Because there are 8 preparations in biodynamics, and each one is made with a certain herb. Right? So there's my herbalism. So like the astrology and the herbal studies intersected in biodynamics for me. And it was like everything, it unlocked. I don't know if it unlocked, but I know that it all converged.
It gave it a home.
It gave it a home. It all made sense. And guess what? It doesn't need to make sense for everybody else, but it makes sense for me and like my interactions with this garden. And the interesting thing is what I realized was when I would talk about this in herbal classes, I could see like almost the glaze with adults. And then when I started working with the kids, I found my audience. Truly, because I mean, real conversations, no filter, no worrying about if something sounds strange. And that day that we were talking about the fire element and like maybe we'll find some salamanders, they were all holding that. And we went into the forest and every kid found a salamander that day. And then one kid told a story that about, did you know that there's like this tree that can't burn in Hawaii? And like, because we started talking about the salamander and how it can live in fire. Think about that. It can live in fire. Like, so for children, and I would say for children up until about 10, that is, of course, that's where they are, right? We get all bogged down with all this stuff and like, and they're just so present, right? And then we worked in the creek. And I said, okay, we're going to work with the undines now. These are the water fairies, right? And so our karma yoga was to clear, right? Clear all the leaves. I didn't draw this curriculum. I went into the forest with my 2 kids and they showed me what it was, right? And then this big gust of wind came through and Arjun goes, Mommy, it's the sylphs. They're They're happy that we're taking care of the water. You get to this place where you're like clearing all the leaves and creating these flowing pathways. I mean, you could work in there all day. My point being is that the child can go into those spaces so easily. And that's when we can do that, everyone says, be childlike, be childlike, be child. It's true.
It's true. And I'm wondering if we're talking about tending the soil and we're talking about nakshatras, which are the Vedic terminology for the houses, just to keep it people moving along on the
For the
terminology.
constellations.
Constellations, I thank you, constellations. The nakshatras are the Vedic terminology for the constellations.
Yes.
And we're talking about cycles and placement, right? We're talking about what you do in spring, you could plant this plant at this time of year, but if you want it to be better, you do it here. And we can also say that that's part of our own being, and we're not all on the same timeline. Some of us thrive
Right.
in winter, some of us thrive in summer. Some of us have different cycles of day that we love. We're just like the plants. We have preferential time. There's not an infinite, sorry, we're not all that unique, honestly. We're kind of
Yeah.
in clumps in what we like, um, and I'm wondering if we could then say, because I'm listening to your story in real time, even though I've heard it, right? So I've
Yeah.
heard a lot of this, some of this I haven't, and there's a reason I'm saying that. But I'm hearing new things because that's what we do in cycles, right? We return to the story, and when the story is placed in a new iteration, neither you or I are the same as the first time we heard it. And so therefore there is this new cycle of medicine that comes through. And I'm wondering if not everyone who wants to be a parent can be. So their life will always find a way to offer
Mm.
this invitation. But for some, just like the Gregorian calendar kind of moves on in this linear path that this is when this happens and this is how this is.
Yeah.
And then the moon-based, the farmer-based, the Celtic, the Vedic, any indigenous culture that is still allowed to be rooted in their land-based says, well, this
Mm.
happens when the timing is right. And so I'm wondering if that's also not an indication of parenting. The cross section of the child and the mother. The mother does not have to be a playful parent, but the mother could open up to more playfulness and a threshold's created. Because
Yeah.
when you open to that, fabulous things happen and unfabulous things get a second chance of being stirred, integrated, and
Mhm.
composted.
Yeah.
And so I'm hearing in this convalescence, and for you, it's a home that has a farm and has chickens. For someone else, it's not going to be that,
No.
but it will be the home, and it will be tending to hearth and placement that is waiting to coalesce within. And I know you work with women in a little bit of the restoration of time and place. Would that be fair? I haven't labeled it that way before, but would that be something, and how the devotion you've had to presence is something that, one, I celebrated in you, but I'm bringing it to the fore because it's really available to everyone, even if it looks nothing like the way that you do it.
100%. And it can be so simple. It can be as simple as lighting a candle, drawing yourself inward, and going outside to something that looks really alive and beautiful, and asking if you can have it, and bringing it in and putting it next to that candle, right? Like, making that offering is a gesture to something sacred. And that sacred can be yourself. It can be God, if that's who you are. It can also be, what is that saying? First there's enlightenment and then the dishes, it's like you don't stay there,
Right.
right? You just don't stay there. You get a glimpse, and
Mm-hmm.
you get a glimpse that's enough to show you what's real and what's not.
Mm-hmm.
And if you have cultivated any type of devotional practice, and it does not have to be an Eastern practice, there are many women that tend to the home that their rituals every day are absolutely sacred. One of the most sacred things I do every day is come downstairs when it's dark, no one around, and I make my chai. Okay. So through having babies, through losing my father, through losing or walking away from my business, through moving, through all the changes, you know what's been there? my chai.
Mhm.
And that may just be a drink to some people, but for me, it's interacting with these herbs and knowing that they are nurturing different parts of my body. And I am giving that pot my full presence.
Mhm.
Okay? And then I take that moment and close my eyes and I take that first sip.
Mhm.
It really isn't complicated. And I found so many, I used to do all these elaborate practices. I mean, I was so austere I went far out. And it was all necessary because I came from I had a lot of detoxing to do. I did not care for my spiritual body, my physical body, my mental body, or any of that until I got sober, And so there was a lot of repair. So I needed to go fully to the other side. And then it brought me back to center. And that is, it doesn't have to be complicated, right? And I think as a mother, we learn that it can actually be watered down even more and still be just as potent.
Mhm.
Because I don't have that 2-hour practice every morning. And
No.
guess what? I was distraught after losing it for a while. I was like, oh my God. And then I just found other things that can happen in smaller bits of time
Mhm.
that can tend my hearth or, right, the flame or whatever it is. Like there are ways. And like even we were talking about like cleaning the house. Like I brew a tea. I pick the plants that represent what I'm trying to cultivate
Mm.
or rid myself of. And I use those plants in a water and I wipe my cabinets. I use that tea because it's symbolic
Mhm.
and it does make a
It
difference.
makes a difference. I don't use that. I use essential oils
Yeah.
to tend because it's the devotion. It's the back and forth of the relationship. I remember my grandmother wanted to get somewhere past the point that she could drive. And in my going to be helpfulness, I was like, well, maybe. And she looked at me, she said, I've already prayed on it. It's coming. But it wasn't like manifestation talk. It was like
No,
old school. It was like, I
much
didn't ask
simpler.
for, yeah. It was like, God's got it. I, and I looked at her, I'm like, oh, that's the steadfast. Oh,
Mm,
and you want it, I won't say you, I wanted it in a different phase, in a younger phase. I wanted it different because she was too close to things that I did and did not like, right?
yeah,
So
yeah,
I couldn't, and not that that hasn't changed. It's just the cycle is different, and you start to see it's just different.
it is.
It's just different.
It's
And I
just,
think what whomever is listening at the time and the place, it's not that the pilgrimage era is wrong. It's not that the staying at home era is wrong. It's the devotion to listen. It's like you said, like the kids haven't been told not to hear. That's something that's really big in my parenting practice is to listen. And then, but if you're at school, don't expect other people to hear what you're saying. Like I'm already teaching him that somebody else doesn't have to hear what you're hearing for your voice not to be true, you know? Because I figure that's one of the biggest skills you need to have now. Right? And it's the same thing. And you know what? That does not mean that I'm not delusional that when he hits like 15, 16, 18, I expect an epoch of that to probably get tossed out the window. I'm thinking long game.
yes,
I'm planting in very well tended soil so that those roots will weather the storm. And that's what I'm hearing with your work and your the way you've tended your life, and how you work with the women that you work with, and that Bridget, who isn't really part of the Vedic lexicon, but then she is, that's the funny
I know.
thing.
It's so, I mean, and that's the other thing. It's like the whole mothercraft thing is when I tapped into the parallels of Celtic and Vedic, it was all one for me.
Which is also your family constellation, is it not?
which is wild. It's wild because it then can get translated to my children as being one, right? So like, and I have like a little blurb on the website about it on these correlations that I make, whether it's with the Ganga and the the Shannon and I'm sorry, the Boyne River. But like even Sanskrit and Gaelic, and there just are so many similarities. And both, the difference is one culture kept records.
Right.
This is why we go east. I'm watching some friends now from my Jyotish community on a pilgrimage in India, and they're going to the nakshatra temples. Okay. This is not pulled out of a hat.
Right.
This is 5,000 years old.
Okay. So if someone, first of all, they should go to your website because you have a website coming up about motherhood and tending the hearth and bringing back
Oh,
the
yeah.
sacred into your everyday. But I'm going to ask you a different question because
Yeah.
if someone's hearing this and they're like, whoa, what would I do? What would be your invitation to them? Like, wow, this sounds great, but I'm not Dan. I have, how the brain could do that to you. I don't have. What would be your invitation to a woman listening right now that has this in her 15 minutes of freedom in the car before she goes back into being busy and the thought leaves? What
Yeah.
would be your invitation to her?
My invitation would be to have a consultation with me, and where we can really go into why it's speaking to you, right? So when I do my herbal consultations, I am using the your birth chart. I'm not giving you a Vedic reading, although I can do that, but I've found that what has been more beneficial is for me to incorporate that into an herbal consultation. And I don't look at the herbal consultation as me prescribing you herbs. It's a lot deeper than that.
Tending the soil, more like that?
Absolutely. And the intake form, right away, you're going to go on a journey before you even get to me, where you've already started to open the door, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then we work together in kind of going deeper into those impulses and what is it that your heart is calling out for, and then the other thing I would say is when I have a workshop about, say, something specific like the one that Liz and I have coming up. Liz and I have collaborated for years, and something that's always like so funny is that we're always like, okay, we have all these different like areas to kind of pull in.
Mm-hmm.
How do we, how are we going to form this, And so you will get in that workshop of, making the home sacred again.
Mm-hmm.
You're going to scratch the itch on your astrology. You're going to scratch the itch on herbalism. You're going to get a dose of Celtic stuff. You're going to get a dose of Vedic, you're going to hear a little bit of yogic talk. You're going to get all of it. It is about that one thing,
but it's an embodiment of the houses that you've drawn from.
Yeah, it's what I bring, and it's how I bring them together. And I have used this for myself, right? I have put these together in a way that gives me gives me meaning on any given day, gives me direction, right? Like I was talking to you about, like knowing when I woke up today that the moon's in Hasta, and what I can access because of that. right? What's available to me today? It's just like the weather.
Right. It is.
It's a sunny day. Well, what's available to me is I could go for a walk. I could, right?
Right.
It's really no different. So I would say that. I would say come to a workshop, schedule a consultation. Like that's a starting point, because then that can be about you. Right? Instead of me going, oh, get this book and get this book and go take this course and go do that, right? It's like, we could do that, but the times have changed. And this seeking outside can get a little tricky, even with people that we thought.
Yeah, it's an internal game. And I think that
Very different.
you go to houses that have wisdom, that have pillars that don't necessitate one person's personality and that rest on a commitment to serve.
Yeah.
And if you have an inspiration that this sounds like a good idea, then it probably means there's things inside of you that are looking for a home. Not in Danielle, but it's a reflection. Yeah, it's oh, she braided it all. I feel resonance to work with her means the forces inside of me are trying to say, you can braid it all too. That's why we're giving you an example, right? That's how we all help each other, because we all have the blind spots. That's part of the human makeup. So we test and tend to our own perception, so that when we have a whisper, we're like, oh, that's the whisper I can listen to, not the wagging finger that I shouldn't listen to. That's my whisper, So I appreciate the journey you've taken us on, because there's a lot of good information. And if you do hear something, everything in here can be resourced. Like if you're interested in Steiner, go on to an anthroposophy site. Like there's all of these things.
It's
Let
a free
yourself
library
go.
online.
Exactly. I use it all the
I
time. You
mean,
can get the count.
everything is available.
Yeah, it's
for
available.
free.
Yeah.
That's the difference.
Still free.
Look at the places you're gathering. Look at the people you're following on social media. Look at the places you're gathering information, and really feel into what the impulse is behind that, right?
Get rid of the grubs. We're going to end the podcast. Get rid of the grubs.
Thank you. Get rid of the grubs.
Danielle, thanks for being on the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
I know you loved that conversation as much as I did. In fact, that conversation came from effort and surrender. And it's the best way I can explain it to you. I am turning this space with your support and your feedback. So I appreciate all of you who have been reaching out and feeling moved by the episodes and sharing your inspiration with me. We're bringing conscious conversation so that we can amplify the time that we need to lean forward into effort, and then we need to prepare to simply receive. So if you felt a stirring when you were hearing Danielle talk about the elements and the wind caressing her face and the children igniting in delight, and thinking about how the patterns of your own ancestry may be beckoning you closer, asking you to let them help, asking you to open yourself up to other possibilities of interpretation that land you precisely where you are, that allow you to braid into yourself and your moment the support that you deserve. If you felt an impetus or a stirring to connect with ancestry, natural elements, or even your own garden, I hope you move forward with it. You have all of our support to do so, and let us know about it. If you've enjoyed this episode, you know what to do. Please share on social media. Go on to Spotify and click that 5-star review. Those things really do help. We are efforting here to slow down, and we need your help to gather more around the fire. As always, we appreciate having you here. And if you did want to learn more about Danielle, go to mothercraftherbal.com. Thanks for tuning in.